I rarely tell this story, not because I'm ashamed of it or afraid to remember, but because every time I think about what happened, I can feel the fear creeping back. It's not the usual kind of anxiety, it's the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder as if someone is watching you even now. I worked as a freight train engineer for over 10 years. It's not the kind of job kids dream about, but I enjoyed it. There's something calming about it. The long hours on the tracks, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the deserted stations where no one disturbs you. That night, I was on a route I knew like the back of my hand. It was supposed to be a routine shift, or so I thought. My shift started at 2, and I took over from a colleague at the station, checked the train, and settled into the cab. The route was enveloped in total silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the rhythmic clanging of the cars behind me. Inside the cab, it was always a bit cozier than outside. The glow of the control panel, the low hum of the engine. Nights like this were almost comforting to me. About an hour into the trip, I noticed the first strange thing. As I crossed a small railway bridge, I thought I saw a faint light flickering in the distance just ahead. It looked like someone holding a flashlight. Maybe track workers, I thought, though officially no work was scheduled at this hour. I contacted the dispatcher, who confirmed the section was clear. Could be hunters or locals, I muttered to myself and continued on, but unease started to creep in. A few minutes later, I saw the light again, this time moving parallel to the tracks, as if someone was walking alongside the train. I turned on the spotlight, but all I saw were bushes and empty ground. Even the grass seemed frozen, as if the world had stopped. I tried to shake it off, blaming fatigue, but then something happened that sent chills through me. Somewhere between stations, on one of the quietest stretches of the route, I heard a sound. It was a dull, barely audible thudding, not the sound of wheels. No, it was something else. The thudding grew louder, and then I realized it was coming from the cars. "This can't be happening," I whispered. The train was empty. I had personally checked it before departure. The thudding became clearer, now resembling footsteps. It was as if someone was walking slowly, deliberately, through the cars, heading toward the cab. I tried to calm myself. Probably something fell or shifted, I thought. Freight cars aren't like passenger cars. They're full of noises, but the sound didn't stop. I grabbed the radio and called the dispatcher. "Something strange is going on here. I think someone might have climbed into one of the cars." Requesting confirmation, the response was quick. "There shouldn't be anyone there. Stop at the next crossing. I'll send a crew to check." There was indeed a crossing ahead, an abandoned one closed to traffic. I slowed the train and brought it to a full stop. Outside the cab, it was pitch dark. I took my flashlight, opened the cab door, and stepped out cautiously. A heavy silence enveloped me. Even the forest sounds were gone. I walked along the train, shining the flashlight on the cars. Everything seemed fine, but when I reached the middle of the train, my flashlight caught something unusual. One of the cars had a small, barely noticeable dent, as if something had struck the metal from the outside. That was impossible. No one could get that close while the train was moving. And then I heard the same thudding. Only now it was much closer. It sounded like someone was inside the car right in front of me. My heart raced and I instinctively stepped back. The sound stopped. "Who's there?" I shouted, shining the flashlight at the car. Silence. No sound, no movement. Only my heavy, ragged breathing broke the dead stillness. I returned to the cab and locked the door. The dispatcher is right, I thought. I just need to wait for the inspection crew. But then I noticed something even stranger. The car door indicator showed that one of the doors was slightly ajar. That was physically impossible. I had checked them myself before departure. While waiting for the crew, I sat in the cab, listening to every little noise. At one point, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. It was quick, almost imperceptible. A figure, a silhouette, I couldn't make it out. I turned the spotlight on and aimed it back. Nothing. When the inspection crew finally arrived, they found nothing. The cars were empty, the doors were locked, and the dent was dismissed as a random encounter with a tree branch. But I knew something had been there that night. Something had been watching me. Since then, I've avoided night shifts. Every time I hear the creak of cars or a strange thudding, I remember that night. I try not to think about what it could have been, and I try not to ask myself the one question that still haunts me. What if it's still out there? My name's Alex. I've been a train driver for 15 years. It's a job that demands precision and calm qualities I prided myself on. But there's one night I'll never forget. The night that made me question everything I thought I knew about my work, about people, and about myself. It started as a routine shift on the night line. A freight train, a few dozen cars, nothing unusual. The route was familiar, a stretch of tracks cutting through forests and small towns, the kind of places you barely notice on a map. It was late autumn and the weather matched the mood, cold, misty, and oppressively quiet. Perfect conditions for a long, uneventful haul. I boarded the locomotive around midnight. My co-driver was out sick, so it was just me. I didn't mind. I'd worked solo shifts before. Besides, it was a straightforward route and the radio kept me company. The first hour passed without incident. I settled into the rhythm of the train, the gentle hum of the engine, the occasional rattle of the cars behind me. The tracks stretched endlessly ahead, a silver ribbon cutting through the darkness. I checked the gauges, adjusted the throttle, and sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos. Routine. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I first noticed a faint flicker of movement at the edge of the tracks. I brushed it off as a deer or maybe a stray dog. Wildlife wasn't uncommon on these routes, especially at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't quite right. The movement had been too deliberate, too human. I kept my eyes on the rails, but the unease lingered. Then, about 20 minutes later, I saw it again. This time, I was sure it was a person. A figure standing just off the tracks, barely visible in the dim glow of the train's headlights. They didn't wave, didn't move, just stood there watching as the train thundered past. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't unheard of for people to loiter near the tracks, sometimes out of boredom, sometimes for reasons darker than I cared to think about. But this felt different. There was something unsettling about the way they stood there, motionless, like a shadow come to life. I radioed the nearest station, reporting a possible trespasser near mile marker 72. The operator acknowledged my call, but their tone was dismissive. "We'll send someone to check it out," they said, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. I tried to shake it off and refocus. The train had a schedule, and I had a job to do. But as the night went on, the sightings continued. Always the same figure, always at the edge of the tracks, never in the same place. Sometimes they were ahead, sometimes behind, but they were always there, watching. By 3 a.m. I was rattled. I told myself it was fatigue playing tricks on me. Long shifts could mess with your head, and the isolation didn't help. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. There was a pattern to their appearances, a calculated precision that was too deliberate to be random. Then came the radio interference. At first it was just static, a faint crackle that I barely noticed, but it grew louder, more persistent, drowning out the dispatcher's voice until all I could hear was a low, guttural hum. I tried adjusting the controls, but nothing worked. The radio was useless, and that's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold, a faint tapping coming from somewhere behind me. At first, I thought it was the engine, maybe a loose panel or a shifting load. But the rhythm was too irregular, too. Human. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like someone was inside the locomotive with me. I turned around, heart pounding, but the cab was empty. Just me, the controls, and the darkness pressing in from all sides. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it around the cab, into the engine room, even out the side windows. Nothing. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if daring me to find its source. I told myself it was just the train settling, the natural groans and creaks of metal in motion. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the reach of the headlights. By 4 a.m., I was on edge. My hands trembled as I gripped the controls, my eyes darting between the tracks and the mirrors. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed amplified. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure stepped onto the tracks. I hit the emergency brake, the train screeching as it fought to slow down. Sparks flew, the wheels groaned, but the figure didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that pierced the darkness. The train came to a stop just a few feet from where they stood. I sat there, heart racing, waiting for them to move, to do something, but they didn't. They just stood there, silent, motionless, their face obscured by the shadows. Summoning what little courage I had left, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The cold air hit me like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. I shone the beam ahead, illuminating the tracks, and found nothing. The figure was gone, vanished as if they'd never been there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the darkness, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the hum of the engine and the distant rustle of leaves. I climbed back into the cab, locked the door, and pushed the throttle forward, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever I'd just seen. The rest of the route passed in a blur. By the time I reached the station, dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the mist. I filed my report, detailing the sightings and the strange events of the night. The station manager listened politely, but offered little more than a nod and a generic assurance that they'd look into it. I don't know what I expected answers maybe, or at least some acknowledgement that what I'd experienced wasn't just in my head. But I got nothing, and maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left unexplained. I've since moved to a different route, one that doesn't run at night. I tell myself it's because the schedule is better, the pay a little higher. But deep down, I know the truth. I couldn't face another night like that, not knowing what I might see or what might see me. I've been a train driver for over 20 years. I've always loved the job, the tranquility of night shifts, the steady hum of the rails, the sense of control over a massive machine. It was my element, right up until that day when I realized that even the most familiar things can turn into nightmares. It happened in early autumn, late at night. I was operating a freight train on a route I knew like the back of my hand, a small branch line through a forest connecting two remote stations. I had traveled this line hundreds of times and nothing strange had ever happened. The night promised to be uneventful. The train was long, consisting of 20 cars loaded with scrap metal. There wasn't another soul on board apart from me. My only companions were the rhythmic clatter of the wheels and the dim glow of the control panel. The first few kilometers passed without incident. The surroundings were dark and silent, the only light coming from the locomotive's headlights, illuminating the gleaming rails and the occasional trees along the tracks. But as I continued, a strange feeling crept over me. The cabin was silent, too silent. Normally, I was accustomed to the ambient noise, the ventilation, the radio chatter, even the faint vibrations of the train. But that night, the sound felt muted, as if the train wasn't moving on rails but on something soft like sand. The first real sign of trouble came around midnight. On one section of the track, I noticed an unusual reflection on the rails. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the lights, but as I got closer, I realized it was blood. A thick, dark, fresh streak stretched along the tracks. I gripped the brake lever and brought the train to a halt as quickly as I could. It took about 10 seconds for the train to come to a complete stop. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cabin, trying to suppress the rising panic. The forest around me was quiet, but not with the usual calm of nature. It was an oppressive silence, as if even the air refused to make a sound. When I reached the spot where the blood trail began, I found its source a dead animal. A deer, most likely, struck by the train. That was strange. I would have felt the impact if the train had hit something, but there had been no impact. I returned to the cabin, trying to calm myself. Just a coincidence, I told myself. The animal could have died earlier and the train simply dragged it along the tracks. But things only got worse. As soon as I started moving again, I heard an unusual noise. It wasn't the familiar clatter of the wheels, but a kind of creaking like metal scraping against metal. I stopped the train again and stepped outside to inspect it, but I couldn't find any damage or issues with the brakes. As I was examining the train, I felt it, that inexplicable sensation that someone was watching me. It's that primal, unshakable awareness you get when you know you're not alone, even if you can't see anyone. I turned around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but all I saw were trees, their trunks illuminated in patches of light. The unease was growing into panic, but I forced myself to return to the cabin and continue the journey. After all, it was just another shift. The next half hour passed relatively calmly. I tried to focus on the controls, on the schedule, but the thought wouldn't leave my mind. Something's not right. And soon, I figured out what it was. When I looked back at the control panel, I noticed that the train speed was inexplicably dropping. I checked the brakes, the engine, everything was functioning normally. Yet the train kept slowing down until it stopped entirely, right in the middle of the dense forest. I picked up the radio to contact the dispatcher, but all I got was static. I tried every frequency silence. I even had my phone with me, but of course there was no signal. I stepped outside again, flashlight in hand. The cold night air wrapped around me, bringing with it the unnerving feeling that I had made a mistake, that I shouldn't have stopped at all. I inspected the wheels and the cars, walking along the train. Then I noticed something odd on one of the cars. The door of a container was slightly ajar. Container doors are always locked, but this one had a broken lock dangling from it. At first I thought it might have been a theft. Someone could have climbed onto the train, broken into the container, and fled. I cautiously peered inside, but the container was empty. Then I felt it again. That presence, and a sound of faint rustling ahead, closer to the locomotive. I decided not to investigate. My instincts screamed at me to stay away. I returned to the cabin, locked the door from the inside, and turned the headlights up to full brightness, illuminating everything in front of the train. But instead of feeling safer, I noticed something else. On the tracks, right in front of the train, someone was standing. The figure was almost motionless, entirely cloaked in shadow, but close enough for me to see its outline. It was a person, or at least something very much like one. I sounded the horn, but the figure didn't move. I flashed the headlights, still no reaction. I wasn't going to wait around. I pushed the throttle to maximum, deciding I wouldn't stop until I reached the next station. The figure disappeared into the darkness, but the feeling that I had just seen someone lingered. I made it to the end of the route and never returned to that line again. Even now, I'm not sure what happened that night. But since then, I've been afraid of the dark.